About the composition Climber 2000 Energy Free by the composer Per Nørgaard.
The organizing committee of Climber 2000 requested me to write a composition for the opening ceremony of the Congress to take place on Monday, 26 August 1985. This commission contained a special condition of a highly specialized nature, in fact so peculiar that in all my career I have never met with a similar demand. The main instrument was to consist of 6 steel tubes placed in the pattern of the main symbol of the Congress, 2 triangles together appearing as one rectangular square. That this peculiar creation of steel was to be colored in blue and red was really of no consequence to me. I was more concerned with the demand that this instrumental symbol, or symbolic instrument, was to be so big that it could be seen with ease by anyone present in the Bella Center, which certainly is a very large hall, even if that anyone was seated in the row farthest away from the stage. That this demand was of vital significance to the composer was made clear by the resulting size of the instrument, nicknamed Climberphone, namely over 3 meters diagonally. To be precise, the 6 tubes were respectively 3,2, 2,5, 2, 2,9, 2,2 and 1,9 meters in length, and the diameter of all the tubes was 11 centimeters. As everyone knows, the sound of a regular body, struck or blown into, is deeper the larger the body. So the 6 tubes were not to ring out like a doorbell or another minor metal object, but more like the bells of a church or a temple. After all, the instrument was also to be heard with ease in the great hall of the Bella Center. Now, since the composition was to last about 15 minutes and create a hopefully welcome contrast to the many words of the opening speakers, it would not be wise to imagine this big double triangle of steel, the Climberphone, as the only producer of sound. This would certainly have been too monotonous, and after a few minutes probably highly irritating. So the piece was to be composed for a variety of percussion instruments, with a Climberphone as a virtual crown hanging over all of them. 6 tom-toms, drums played with handsticks, and 6 foot drums played on pedals, a vibraphone, a bass marimba, plus an assortment of smaller metallic and wooden percussion instruments. Did I forget to mention that all this large assortment was to be played by just one person, Gert Sørensen. He is a very young and very gifted percussionist of the famous Danish percussion breed, which has fostered such great musicians as Bent Lylloff, Einar Nielsen, and Gert Mortensen, for whom I have composed respectively the percussion works Waves, Sextet, and I Ching. So I was certainly spoiled with regard to what I might reasonably demand of a percussionist when I began composing Climber 2000 for Gert Sørensen. I hasten to add that this freewheeling possibility of asking the almost impossible of the soloist was not for me a self-centered goal, or in other words, virtuosity for virtuosity's sake, in order to impress with a percussion tour de force. Not at all. For me, a beautiful composition is always as simple as possible, but no more. So, if the idea of the piece demands the most concentrated efforts of the player, I'll make those demands, if the player is there, and if I consent to writing the piece. The organizers wanted me to name the composition according to the name of the Congress, Climate 2000, to which I agreed with some hesitation. After all, it's rather a funny title with which to burden a work for the rest of its possible life, isn't it? My solution to this minor dilemma was to add a specification to the main title, as you know now, energy free. This specification did not signify, as the president feared, that I would claim free heating around the millennia shift. No, the title contains a far more generalized idea. Today, as yesterday, we live in a world full of repression, fear, and hunger. A lot of each human being's potential energy is suppressed by this state of negative emotions. My call, utopian perhaps, for the future, for the year 2000, is that all this creative energy be given free by a truly humanitarian society, characterized by love and respect between all people on this earth. The composition Climate 2000, Energy Free, is in some way identical with this call for free energy, since it's realized in the work in a special rhythmical manner never heard before, where all tones or attacks are free, that is, unhindered by clashing together with other tones or attacks at the same moment. Don't mistake this for the description of, for instance, a simple melody, about which you might say the same. No, in Climate 2000, Energy Free, there's all the time several layers of melody and tempo unfolding simultaneously. How is this possible if two attacks are not allowed to be presented at the same moment? Only by one complicated rhythmical and melodic line that is always open to several melodic and rhythmic interpretations. How this is done cannot be explained in detail here and now, but all participants of the Congress will have the opportunity of gaining an insight into this ambiguous musical universe each time there is a call for sessions. Complying with the wish of the organizers, I have made a call on the climaphone, which will be played over the loudspeakers before each session. Or rather, I have made 3 different calls to alternate, so you will never know beforehand which one you will hear. Or rather, it is the same call, but with one little difference. Let's call them A, B, and C. In B, the first tone of A is omitted, and in C, the first tone of B is omitted. Otherwise, they consist of the same tones and the same durations. But they sound very different. You may check it yourself, since the beginning of the work is identical with these 3 calls. You will admit, I think, that in spite of only this one small difference, you hear 3 different melodies in each their own tempo: fast, slower, and slowest. Economical, isn't it?
Per Nørgaard is one of Denmark's leading composers. The originality of his compositions, his significant influence on the younger generation of Danish composers, his numerous contributions to current debate, together with his organizational talent, have made Per Nørgaard a central figure in Danish musical and intellectual life. Per Nørgaard studied first at the Royal Danish Music Conservatorium in Copenhagen as a pupil of the composer Van Halmbo, and made his debut in 1956 with the work Aftonland, which he dedicated to Sibelius, whose Nordic influence was strong on the young composer. From 1956, he studied for 1 year with Nadia Boulanger in Paris, where his style tended towards the neoclassical, for example in the work Triptychon. In 1957, Pierre Nørgaard received the Lily Boulanger Prize. His early compositions are often characterized by a Nordic sound, but his contact with European avant-garde music, dodecaphonic music inspired by Anton Webern, as well as electronic music, brought Pierre Nørgaard closer to international trends. In the 1960s, he worked with various stylistic models, which found their expression in, for example, sketches, prisma, and studies and fragments. From the middle of the 1960s, Pierre Nørgaard taught at the Music Conservatorium in Aarhus, and at this point in his career, with his innovative ideas, he became a central figure among Danish composers. He attracted a group of young Danish composers, a kind of study group, where new trends and ideas in European music were keenly discussed. His reputation spread during the 1960s and 1970s to Europe and the USA, partly due to the performance of his works at festivals of the International Society of Contemporary Music. At this point, Pierre Nørgaard worked intensely with serial music and with theoretical and acoustical problems. In Iris and Luna, from the late 1960s, we hear collage music and new sounds, and with Voyage into the Golden Screen from 1968, Pierre Nørgaard's own version of the serial technique became apparent, namely a non-dodecaphonic infinity series, which has become typical of his composition technique. With an infinity series, a melodic line is created according to certain rules, starting with a particular interval and continuing in upward and downward motion. Based on the golden section, Pierre Nørgaard includes also rhythmical series. Harmonically, a series of overtones and undertones are used, in which major and minor modes are recognizable. A combination of all these systems is to be found in Pierre Nørgaard's opera Gilgamesh from 1974, the theme being taken from the ancient Babylonian heroic poem about the ruler who believes that he is divine until he at last realizes that he is indeed mortal and must accept his mortality. For his opera Gilgamesh, Pierre Nørgaard was the first Danish composer to receive the prize of the Nordic Council. One of Pierre Nørgaard's main works is his Third Symphony from 1976, in which the infinity series is used with rhythms which follow a pattern according to the golden section. Pierre Nørgaard has recently been working with a special aspect of the series, a selection of ideas which limits itself to two different tones, one light and one dark. On the background of a rhythmic pattern, Pierre Nørgaard has composed a group of pieces, mainly for percussion, but often with vocal or instrumental accompaniment, and even dance. This rhythmical pattern is apparent in such works as I Ching for percussion, Wie ein Kind, and Drømmesange, all from the beginning of this decade. With his special composition technique, Pierre Nørgaard has unlimited possibilities for creating melodies, rhythms, and patterns. An eternal spring where many works call upon the same thematic material and are symbiotic in character, but nevertheless with a thematic affinity, as in Nova Genitura and Frost Psalms, Winterkantate, and Kresløb. With his deep insight into musical acoustics and his exceptional intellectual capacity, Pierre Nørgaard is a composer of great potential who is well on the way to international renown.